The city above was thriving, or so it seemed. Skyscrapers reached for the heavens, and the streets buzzed with life. But beneath the surface, a different world existed, a world where shadowy figures moved in silence. Ethan, the reluctant hero who had once been lost in the chaos of this underworld, now stood at the precipice of something much larger. The echoes of past decisions, mistakes, and betrayals weighed heavily on him. Ethan had come a long way since the early days of his involvement with the underground. His ties to the city's criminal factions had been severed, but that didn't mean the past had forgotten him. A war was brewing between those who still wanted control of the city below, and those who believed it was time for a new order. In the middle of it all, Ethan was fighting for redemption. He had found an unlikely ally in the form of Isabella, a vlogger who had stumbled upon the city below while investigating urban myths for her YouTube channel. Her ability to capture the world in her lens and her relentless pursuit of the truth had made her a target for both sides. But she had a strength that few could match, a fearlessness to expose the corruption that lay at the heart of the city. Together, they had uncovered the truth about a hidden faction within the city's power structure, one that planned to destroy everything to secure their own dominance. As they dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling plot. The city above was about to fall into chaos, and the ones orchestrating it were not just criminals. They were part of the military-industrial complex, using the city below as their testing ground. The moment of truth came faster than anyone had anticipated. The city's leadership, in league with the military, had long been manipulating the population below. But now, they were about to launch a final strike to take control. Ethan and Isabella had learned that the city's power grid was to be sabotaged, triggering a series of events that would cause the collapse of both the city above and below. In the dead of night, Ethan's old ally Marcus, whom he thought had disappeared years ago, showed up with a warning. Marcus, a former military officer, revealed that the betrayal ran deeper than they had imagined. He confessed that he had been part of the operation, but had come to regret his decisions. The military's plan was to use a new weapon, one that could destabilize the very foundation of the city. And Marcus, with his insider knowledge, had a way to stop it, but only if they acted fast. Ethan, feeling the weight of his past, found himself questioning everything he had once believed in. Marcus' appearance was no coincidence. It was part of the plan to draw Ethan out and ensure his compliance. The betrayal cut deep. Ethan had trusted Marcus, and now he was faced with a brutal truth. Those closest to him had always had their own agendas. The city had been a pawn in a much larger game. As Ethan and Isabella planned their next move, they realized they couldn't do it alone. The city's underworld was divided. Some factions still loyal to the military, others desperate for change. But among them was a faction that had grown tired of the constant betrayal and manipulation. Led by an enigmatic figure named Lila, the group was made up of former criminals, tech hackers, and resistance fighters. Lila's group had their own grudges with the city's elite, and they were more than willing to help. But there was a catch. They demanded that Ethan make a public confession. They wanted him to expose the truth behind the military's involvement, the corrupt leaders, and the lies that had kept the city below in the shadows for so long. It was a risk, but Ethan knew it was the only way to unite the fractured resistance. Isabella, ever the vlogger, saw the potential for something bigger. She had captured enough footage to create a documentary that could not only expose the truth, but also rally the people of the city. As she pieced together the footage, she realized the depth of the betrayal. The military had been conducting experiments, testing weapons that could reshape the very fabric of society. And the city below was ground zero. With the clock ticking down, the resistance moved in. They had one chance to stop the military's plan and expose the truth. The city's power grid was the key to everything. If they could take it down, they could prevent the military's weapon from activating. But the military was one step ahead. They had already infiltrated the city below, placing spies within the resistance and setting traps to ensure the operation failed. Ethan, Isabella, Marcus, and Lila led the charge, breaking through the city's defenses in a desperate attempt to reach the control room. Along the way, they encountered old foes and new enemies. Betrayal was never far behind. As they descended deeper into the heart of the city, the walls seemed to close in. The very structure of the underground was rigged to collapse, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. At the control room, the final confrontation took place. The military's top brass, led by General Havoc, awaited them. Havoc, a man with no conscience, had orchestrated the entire plot, believing that the collapse of the city would give rise to a new world order. He had no intention of letting Ethan and the resistance succeed. A brutal battle ensued. Explosions rang out, and gunfire echoed through the tunnels. Ethan fought with everything he had, his body bruised and bloodied, but his resolve stronger than ever. Isabella, using her vlogging skills, broadcasted the battle live, revealing the truth to the world above. Lila and her fighters held off the military's reinforcements, giving Ethan the chance to face General Havoc. In a final showdown, Ethan and Havoc clashed. The general was a skilled fighter, but Ethan had something he lacked: the will to fight for something bigger than himself. As the battle raged on, Marcus made the ultimate sacrifice, detonating a series of explosives that took down the power grid, preventing the military's weapon from being activated. With the power grid destroyed and the military's plan thwarted, the city below began to crumble. The once proud underground world was now in ruins, but it was also free. The resistance had won, but at a great cost. Ethan stood amidst the wreckage, reflecting on everything he had lost and everything he had gained. The betrayal he had faced had shattered him, but it had also forged him into something stronger. Isabella's documentary went viral, revealing the full extent of the military's involvement in the city's downfall. The world above was left in shock, and the people began to demand accountability. The city below, though destroyed, had ignited a spark of change. As for Ethan, he had redeemed himself. But at what price? The city had been saved, but the road ahead was uncertain. He had become a symbol of resistance, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The world above still had its own battles to face. And in the shadows, new betrayals were already taking root. The final battle had been won, but the war for the city's survival was far from over. This was just the beginning. Betrayal below. The final battle for the city's survival was a story of redemption, betrayal, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to let their city die. The final chapter was written, but the story of the city below would continue, because true survival never ends. The dust had barely settled, but the world above was already stirring with questions. Ethan, now a symbol of resistance, felt the weight of his choices more than ever. He and Isabella stood at the edge of what remained of the city below, staring out into the ruins. The once thriving underground had crumbled, but in its destruction, something new was taking shape. A new order, forged from the ashes, was beginning to emerge. But redemption came at a price. The people of the city below were scattered, broken, and fearful. The powerful factions had fallen, but there were those who sought to seize power in the chaos. There was no immediate peace. As much as Ethan and Isabella had hoped for a fresh start, the truth was more complicated. The people who had once lived in the shadows of the city were now thrust into the light, unsure of what their future held. Isabella's vlogs had captured the raw emotion of the moment, showing the world the faces of the people who had fought, bled, and died for the city's freedom. Her documentary not only exposed the military-industrial complex's manipulation, but also sparked an international conversation about the fragile nature of power. The world above was starting to take notice, but it was clear that the system was not going to crumble easily. The media frenzy that followed was intense. Governments, corporations, and military officials were scrambling to manage the fallout. Investigations were launched, but corruption ran deep, and no one was sure who could be trusted anymore. The city below had exposed the cracks in society, and now, no one could ignore them. Ethan, still haunted by the ghosts of his past, knew the battle was not over. The military's defeat was only one victory, and the fight for real change had only just begun. He turned to Isabella, the only person who seemed to understand the burden he carried. "We did it, but the hard part is just beginning," Ethan said, his voice heavy. Isabella nodded, her camera still rolling. She had captured every moment, but now, there was no script to follow. There was only the truth, and the truth was that they had only begun to scratch the surface of the city's rot. The rise of new factions wasn't the only threat they had to face. As the city continued to rebuild, new enemies emerged. Those who had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance. Among them was the Vanguard, a militant group that had once been part of the military's covert operations, but now had their own agenda. They were well-trained, highly organized, and determined to take control of what remained of the city below. The Vanguard had been responsible for some of the most devastating attacks during the final stages of the battle, including sabotage operations and assassinations of key resistance leaders. While the military had been defeated, this new faction was proving to be just as ruthless. Ethan and Isabella found themselves once again in the midst of a war they hadn't expected. The Vanguard's tactics were brutal, relying on fear and control to establish their dominance. They sought to consolidate power by eliminating anyone who stood in their way. One fateful evening, as Ethan and Isabella were walking through the remnants of the city below, they received word that Lila, the leader of the former resistance, had been captured. The Vanguard had taken her hostage, using her as leverage to demand the surrender of the remaining resistance forces. Ethan knew that Lila was more than just a leader. She was a symbol of everything they had fought for. Her capture was a direct challenge to everything they stood for, and the stakes had never been higher. "We can't let them break us again," Ethan said, determination hardening in his voice. "We get her back, or we burn this city to the ground." Isabella, who had been documenting every turn of the war, glanced at Ethan. She saw the fire in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had stumbled into the city below years ago. He had changed, become stronger in ways he hadn't imagined possible. But the weight of what they were about to do weighed heavily on them both. The rescue mission to free Lila was one of the most dangerous they had ever attempted. The Vanguard had set up a heavily fortified compound, and infiltrating it was no easy task. But Ethan, Isabella, and a small group of resistance fighters led the charge. Their goal was clear: free Lila, neutralize the Vanguard's leadership, and restore some semblance of order to the chaos. The mission unfolded with precision, but there was no room for error. The Vanguard was ruthless in their defense, and they had resources that the resistance could only dream of. There was no room for hesitation. Every step was calculated, and every move could be their last. As Ethan and his team breached the compound's outer defenses, they encountered fierce resistance. Explosions rocked the walls as gunfire echoed through the night. It was chaos, pure, unrelenting chaos. But they pressed on, guided by the belief that they had to succeed. They couldn't afford to fail. Inside the compound, they found Lila, battered but alive. Her spirit was unbroken, but it was clear that the Vanguard had used every means possible to break her. She was a woman who had seen the worst of what humanity had to offer, and yet, she still fought for a better future. Her capture had been a brutal attempt to demoralize the resistance, but Lila had never been one to go down without a fight. With Lila freed, They made their escape, but not without loss. The vanguard had planted explosives throughout the compound, setting off a chain reaction that threatened to destroy everything in its path. Ethan and his team barely made it out alive, carrying Lila with them as the compound collapsed into ruin behind them. In the aftermath of the mission, Ethan knew that this was a turning point. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The vanguard would not give up so easily. They would come for them again, stronger and more determined than ever. The city was on the brink of a new era, but the darkness was far from gone. The vanguard's defeat was temporary, but they had gained something valuable in the fight: a new sense of unity. The resistance, now more organized than ever, had one goal: to take back control of their city and ensure that the people would never again be at the mercy of those who would exploit them. But the price of this unity was high. As the resistance grew stronger, so did their enemies. New alliances were formed, and new betrayals loomed on the horizon. For every victory, the resistance lost something precious. The sacrifices were mounting, and Ethan, more than anyone, felt the burden of every life lost. In the final moments of this long and brutal conflict, as the sun set over the ruins of the city below, Ethan stood once more at the edge of what had once been the heart of the city. His body was broken, but his resolve had never been stronger. The battle for the city's survival was far from over, but the seeds of change had been sown. The people of the city below had tasted freedom, and they would never let it go. But whether the world above would change remained uncertain. Ethan, standing side by side with Isabella and Lila, knew that the war had forged them into something greater than they could have ever imagined. In the end, survival wasn't just about fighting the battles. It was about remembering what they were fighting for. The final battle was just the beginning. The dust had barely settled when it became clear. Victory was not as simple as dismantling the vanguard. Despite their loss, the military-industrial complex's influence still loomed large. The people of the city below were left to pick up the pieces, but what came next was a painful reckoning. The damage to the city's infrastructure was catastrophic, and resources were running low. With the power structure in disarray, the city became a battleground for new factions eager to fill the void. Isabella, her camera ever present, documented the new struggle. She was no longer just a vlogger. She had become an integral part of the resistance's effort to rebuild the city's fractured spirit. Yet, the fight to reclaim their future wasn't just physical. It was ideological. Ethan's resolve was tested every day, as he found himself grappling with the realization that peace, when it came, would be hard-won. In a clandestine meeting, the remnants of the old resistance forces came together to discuss their next move. They had liberated Lila and countless others, but the vanguard's true leader, Commander Ares, had vanished into the shadows. It wasn't enough to dismantle the faction. They had to ensure that Ares didn't have the resources or the will to reignite the war. "We can't afford to let our guard down," Lila said, her voice heavy with the weight of their recent victories. "Ares won't be gone for long. He'll regroup and strike when we least expect it." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his thoughts clouded by the uncertainty of the future. It was impossible to tell if the people had truly learned from the mistakes of the past. The struggle for survival had united them, but unity was fragile, and old rivalries were quick to resurface. "I don't know if we're ready for another fight," Ethan muttered, his voice filled with doubt. "Every day feels like we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We're not just rebuilding the city, we're rebuilding trust." Isabella, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "The people won't trust us if we can't give them a reason to. We've shown them what we're capable of. But now we need to prove we're not just a reaction to the old world. We need to give them hope, not just survival." Her words resonated deeply with the group, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the faintest spark of optimism. But it was fragile. Every choice they made now felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. As expected, the peace that followed the vanguard's fall was short-lived. A few months after their victory, whispers of a resurgence began to spread. The vanguard had not been eradicated, merely scattered. Commander Ares had been lying low, carefully biding his time. From the shadows, he began to orchestrate a new rebellion. This time, he had a different vision for the city below. He wasn't just trying to control the city. He intended to reshape it entirely. Ares had gone underground, but his network was still intact. He had supporters within the city's remaining factions, people who felt abandoned by the fragile peace that Ethan and the resistance had tried to build. Ares promised them a city of true power, where they could rise above the chaos and take control once again. He spoke of a world where the strong dominated, where power was no longer something to be negotiated but seized. And so, a new war began, one that threatened to eclipse everything they had fought for. The vanguard's return was swift and brutal. Ares' forces launched a series of devastating attacks on the infrastructure the resistance had spent months rebuilding. Energy grids were sabotaged, food supplies were poisoned, and the people once again found themselves living in fear. The streets of the city below, now eerily quiet, were once again filled with the sound of gunfire. Ethan, who had hoped that they could stabilize the city, found himself once more thrust into the heart of the struggle. The stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just a battle for power. It was a battle for the soul of the city itself. Would the city below descend back into the darkness they had fought so hard to escape? Or could they rise once more? Ethan, Isabella, Lila, and the remnants of the resistance knew that their time for hope was running out. The vanguard's reach had grown too large, and Ares was once again at the helm of a well-funded, well-trained military force. The city below was now a war zone, with every corner of the underground and its slums caught in a deadly battle for survival. There was no time left for hesitation. Every decision had to be made with the knowledge that they might not make it through the day. The final confrontation with Ares would not be fought with brute force alone. Ethan knew that to defeat the vanguard, they needed to unite the fractured factions of the city below. Each group had its own ambitions, its own desires, but if they didn't find a way to set those differences aside, they would all be crushed under the weight of Ares' new regime. Ethan, who had once fought alone, now realized that true victory wouldn't come from individual heroics. It would come from the strength of unity. He turned to Lila, his longtime ally, and Isabella, who had proven herself to be much more than just a documentarian. We need to put our trust in the people. The resistance can't just be us. It has to be everyone who believes in a future for this city, Ethan said, his voice resolute. Lila nodded, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We'll rally the factions. The city isn't lost yet. We still have a chance. Isabella, her camera rolling as always, caught the moment. She wasn't just capturing the story for the world anymore. She was part of it. Her footage had become a powerful tool, showing the world that there was more to the story than just war and destruction. There was humanity, there was struggle, and there was hope. The battle for the city below would be their last. Ethan and the resistance forces united every faction that had once been torn apart by old rivalries. They had no choice but to fight with everything they had. This time, they were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to ensure that the city below could have a future beyond the chaos. As they prepared for the final assault on Ares' stronghold, Ethan and his team knew that this battle would determine the future of the city. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure was not an option. The city was depending on them. The night of the final battle, the air was thick with tension. Explosions rang out, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels as Ethan, Lila, Isabella, and the resistance forces pushed forward. Their mission was simple: eliminate Ares, take back control of the city, and put an end to the suffering. Inside Ares' stronghold, They found themselves face to face with a man who had once been their greatest enemy. Ares stood tall, his eyes cold and calculating, the weight of the city's fate hanging in the balance. "This is where it ends, Ethan," Ares said, his voice low. "You can't defeat me. This city belongs to those who are willing to take it." Ethan, battered but resolute, stepped forward. "The city belongs to everyone, Ares. It's time for you to let go." In that moment, the two men locked eyes, a final confrontation that would echo through the history of the city below. With one last push, the resistance fought back with everything they had. The battle raged on, and in the end, it was not brute force that triumphed, but the strength of the people united against a common enemy. As the smoke cleared and the city began to rebuild once more, Ethan stood at the edge of what had once been the heart of the city below. The final battle had been won, but the war for the city's soul was not over. They had emerged victorious, but the road to true peace would be long and uncertain. Ethan and Isabella knew that the city had been forged in the crucible of war, and now it was time to shape its future. The world above had seen their struggle, and the people of the city below had risen to meet the challenge. The fight had been for more than survival. It had been for a new beginning, and as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ethan knew one thing for certain. The city below had a chance, not just to survive, but to thrive. The story of betrayal, survival, and redemption had come full circle. Now, the city below would rise again, stronger, united, and ready to face whatever the future held. But this was just the beginning. The fight for the future would continue. Months passed, and the city below began to heal. The dust of the final battle had settled, and the people, once divided by factions, betrayed by the corrupt system, and broken by war, slowly started to rebuild their homes, their lives, and their trust in each other. Yet, the scars were deep, and the road to true peace was far from simple. Ethan, now a reluctant leader, walked through the streets with a heavy heart. The weight of his past and the responsibility of his future rested on his shoulders. Every decision felt like a gamble, too many lives at stake. And though the city was recovering, it was still fragile. The delicate balance between factions teetered, with old wounds reopening as the wounds of war began to fester. Isabella, ever by his side, had stopped filming. There was no need for a documentary now. The people had lived through the story, and now they were writing their own. But her role, even in the aftermath, was still critical. She helped to bridge the gap between the leaders and the people, making sure that no voice went unheard. "We've come so far," Isabella said one evening as they stood overlooking the city, the setting sun casting long shadows across the streets. "But I still don't feel like we've won yet." Ethan's eyes were distant as he gazed down at the city, its silhouette emerging against the horizon like a tired but defiant monument. "Victory isn't just about surviving," he replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It's about ensuring the future is different. But I'm not sure we can change what we've already lost." Lila, who had become a quiet but strong presence in the new government, joined them. "Change takes time, Ethan," she said. "Maybe what we've won isn't just a city. Maybe it's the chance to rebuild from the ashes. And that's something no one can take from us." But even as they spoke, a new danger loomed. There were whispers among the remnants of the vanguard. Ares may have been defeated, but there were still pockets of resistance. The fractured city still had its enemies, those who would see it burn to the ground in their quest for power. Ethan, Lila, and Isabella knew that the battle was not truly over. But this time, they wouldn't face it as enemies. They would face it as a united front. Despite their best efforts to hold the fragile peace together, the city's reconstruction was interrupted when a new threat arose from within. A faction that had been aligned with the resistance before, disgruntled by the compromises made during the rebuilding process, decided to take matters into their own hands. In a stunning betrayal, Aiden, a former ally of Ethan and Lila, emerged as the leader of a new faction bent on overthrowing the current government. He accused Ethan of compromising too much, of forgetting the true cause of their fight. He gathered those who felt marginalized, those who saw the new city as a betrayal of the revolution's ideals. Aiden's followers launched a coordinated attack on the city's infrastructure, sabotaging power grids and key resource lines, throwing the city below into chaos once more. The people, already fragile, began to panic, fearing that everything they had fought for was slipping through their fingers. Ethan knew this wasn't just a fight for the city's survival. It was a test of everything they had believed in. Could they continue to rebuild? Or would they be consumed by the very flames of betrayal they had tried to extinguish? With his team by his side, Ethan prepared for what would be the final confrontation. The choice was clear: end the cycle of violence once and for all, or lose everything. The last battle took place on the streets of the city below, where the ghosts of the past seemed to haunt every corner. Ethan, Lila, and Isabella led their forces, fighting against Aiden's faction. As the two former allies faced off in the heart of the city, the tension between them was palpable. "Aiden, this isn't the way," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. "We can build a better future. We don't need to destroy everything we fought for." Aiden's eyes were cold, filled with fury. "You've become everything you hated, Ethan. You've sold out. You're just another part of the system now." But Ethan's resolve was unshakable. He knew what was at stake. As the battle raged on, it became clear that there could be no compromise. The future of the city below was on the line, and only one side could emerge victorious. In a final, desperate clash, Ethan faced Aiden. Their battle was brutal, both physically and emotionally. Ethan knew this wasn't just about the city. It was about their shared past, the brotherhood they had once forged in the fires of war. But in the end, it was Ethan who stood victorious. With a heavy heart, he subdued Aiden, choosing not to kill him, but to end the violence once and for all. Aiden was taken into custody, his plans for revolution crushed. With Aiden defeated, the city below was left to rebuild once again. This time, however, there was a sense of finality to the effort. The betrayals, the wars, the struggles, all had led them to this moment. Ethan, Isabella, and Lila understood that they had given everything for this city, and now they were free to truly shape its future. Ethan stood on the balcony of the new council building, gazing down at the city. It was battered, scarred, but still standing. The sun was rising over the ruins, casting a new light on the broken streets. "It's not perfect," Isabella said, standing beside him. "But it's ours." Ethan nodded, the weight of the past still heavy on his shoulders. "Yeah," he said quietly, "it's ours, and it's worth fighting for." The city was no longer a place of betrayal, darkness, and war. It was a place of hope, of new beginnings. It would take time, patience, and hard work to heal completely. But for the first time, the people of the city below believed that they could. The final battle was over. The city had survived, and in that survival, they had found something more important than victory. They had found a future. The end.